And as we wait for the president there in Mar-a-Lago, we want to bring in retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. He's a former destroyer squadron commander and a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Admiral, thank you for joining us. The first thing I want to ask you is just, we've talked a little bit about it, but the logistics and the risks of pulling off something like this. We talked a little bit about the raid and bin Laden, and something as small as when they practiced it, the fence was chain link, and when they landed in the compound, it was a solid wall. So the backwash hit the helicopter, and that ended up causing that helicopter to crash. No, of course, they sensed it. But there are 1,000 little things that can go wrong, which is why so many American leaders choose not to send in troops unless they absolutely have to. Did they absolutely have to in this case, and do you think it was a good call?
Well, yeah, firstly, I do. Thank you for having me. And I do think this is the right call because there was a capture part to this. This was not kill or capture. The Special Operating Forces, the Delta Force plus the 160th Aircraft Squadron needed to be in play in order to capture Maduro and his wife. If it was just a kill mission, then you can just use munitions. But for this kind of for the kind of tasking they had, which was to bring him to law enforcement justice, which is the right signal to send to everyone in the in the narco-terrorist industry, that we will find you, hunt you down, capture you, and like Manuel Noriega, put you in jail both in the U.S. and Panama for 30 years until you die. You did have to put boots on the ground, so to speak. Now, these are very special boots on the ground. They can protect themselves. It was done simultaneously with airstrikes that distracted the Venezuelan security forces. So really well executed, really well timed. The idea that they could roll 4 days, seemingly, flawlessly is a real testament to the skill set of the special operators involved.
Admiral, we appreciate your joining us. Is it safe to assume that U.S. forces are no longer on the ground in Venezuela? And how long do we keep this armada parked off the coast?
So I think it's probably safe to say Title 10 forces, in other words, U.S. military forces, are not on the ground. I would not say it's safe to say that Title 50 forces, which are intelligence, CIA and others, aren't necessarily on the ground, and they weren't there beforehand, kind of setting up, ensuring the success of this mission. So that's kind of how I describe it. And how long this will go, look, the president he hasn't been an advocate of regime change, but that's where we are right now. And unlike the strikes in Iran where, he did the action and then said the fight's over, well, we still have a problem here, which is that the defense minister and the Justice Interior Minister, who are both Maduro cronies and, cold-hearted criminals, they are not leaving yet, right? And until we resolve that issue and which way the military and intelligence career, officials kind of go in this country, and until we have Machado and the other Democrats, the opposition forces in power, we're probably committed to continuing to pressure the country to force the final, the final aspects of regime change. By grabbing Maduro like this, I think we're slightly into this problem for at least a few more weeks, if not months.
And given those individuals you just mentioned and how people can react when pressured into a corner, as these guys are about to be in the next couple of weeks, is there a risk? What are the risks right now for the big flotillas of American soldiers and assets still based in the Caribbean? Should they be concerned about counterstrikes?
Well, they'll be prepared, but I think there's a low risk to force here because there's a very limited capability on the Venezuelan side. And a lot of that strike today, part of it was to distract away so the soft forces could get in. But the second part of that was a note to the Venezuelan military and intelligence community. This is not a fight you want to be in. Right. So I think there was strong signaling sent. We struck you deeply in your most important command centers with ease. You probably don't want this fight. And that was the same signal we sent the justice minister and the defense minister with. You probably need to leave the country, get to Cuba soon. And then the opposition forces can more easily, take power. But, I think we are doing some strong signaling here. Our forces, I don't think, are at risk, but they clearly have to keep a defensive, keep their guard up and then be ready to strike when the president orders it. And by the way, if they're shot at by the Venezuelans, the U.S. forces, I think that there is a very extensive second and third strikes ready to go, if necessary, against all of the Venezuelan military forces, and not near as discreet as the attack last night was.
Well, it sounds like this flotilla is going to be there for some time then. Admiral, does that include the USS Jerry Ford? We moved that out of the Mediterranean to join other forces in the Caribbean, and some of our European allies would like to see it go back. Where is it most needed, and how does that deliberation take place?
So I think to the Gerald Ford, I commanded a carrier strike group as well, and you kind of have a feeling for how long their deployments are. They're nearing the end of their deployment one way or the other. I don't think they're going back to Europe. I think when this is over, they'll go back to their home port on the East Coast in Norfolk, in Virginia. That is not where they're not headed back to Europe. But I do think as soon as we can get it done would be good. Same with all the destroyers that are doing the missions there, because we're burning a lot of readiness in an area that we had not planned on burning readiness when the schedules were written 6 and 8 months ago.
I also want to ask you about the psychological warfare aspect of this. As the U.S. pushes for regime change in the next days, weeks to come, I found it very interesting that you have a on-the-record confirmation to the New York Times from the Central Intelligence Agency that not only were they following them on drones, but saying outright, we have a source inside the Maduro government. That's how we found him. That's how we got that. Is that to try to sow the seeds of distrust and paranoia within the remaining ranks of the Maduro apparatus and hopefully spawn some infighting?
Well, you're spot on there. As I said, this is the natural culmination of a maximum pressure campaign. All those information operations is an important part of that maximum pressure campaign. And exactly, do they have a spy, deep in, a source deep inside the Maduro regime? Probably. Is it great to say you have it no matter what? Definitely. So, these are all elements of a maximum pressure campaign. I think the president, I don't agree with every step he did in this, but boy, did he carry it out aggressively and properly over nearly 3 months, and culminating in last night's events.
What about this operation would you like to know when the president reaches the podium, Admiral? There are obviously going to be some details he cannot share. But when he spoke on Fox News earlier, he brought down detail right down to their bedroom. He said the Maduros were pulled out of bed in the middle of the night. What else would you like to know that'll help us understand the next steps here?
I think it'd be important to know what are his intentions with the rest of Maduro's high-ranking cronies. I mean, he labeled that whole narco-terrorist organization a foreign terrorist organization. So there's a lot more people that are in theory, subject to American action here. And so, the other ministers, the vice president, what are his intentions? How does he help Venezuela transition from where they are now to the actual Democrat, for the 2024 elections, the democratically elected leadership? And how do we get the opposition into power in a seamless way that, that allows Venezuela to restore democracy and get moving forward?
What would be your next move if you were advising the president? What is the most important thing he can do in the next few days?
I think it's give a time frame to those senior leaders to leave the country, and if they don't, hold them accountable. I mean, they have choices here, right? This is their last moment of choice, right? The 2 or 3 really senior leaders. You have 24 or 48 hours to get to Cuba. We won't shoot down any aircraft headed to Cuba. You go to Cuba, and we can move forward with the rest of the military and intelligence services. And we have a real challenge here. In most countries, several hundred colonels or generals will have gone to the U.S. Army War College, to West Point, to other things, and they'll have relationships with U.S. military personnel that we can leverage and talk to them. We don't have that with Venezuela. All that stuff was cut off 20 plus years ago. And so we don't have the good relationship there. So it's going to need to be the president delivering that message very clearly, that you need to leave and you have a time frame. And if you don't leave, we'll hold you accountable.
Mm-hmm. want to ask you about justification here and legality, Admiral, and I'll just warn you that when the president speaks, we are planning to join him live, so I'd be loath to interrupt you. But we heard from Senator Mike Lee earlier, who initially expressed concerns about the lack of a War Powers Act or an authorization for the use of military force. He spoke with Secretary Marco Rubio and wrote on Twitter, I should say, not Truth Social, that what we saw tonight was kinetic action deployed to protect and defend those executing the arrest warrant. Does force protection justify the actions that we saw overnight?
Certainly, that's one of the legal premises they can use. I think a more coherent one would be to say, look, we've declared the Venezuelan leadership a foreign terrorist organization, and we've declared them a risk to U.S. national security, and therefore we are taking these actions. I think that that's a more clear, traditional way that the United States has justified use of force since 2001. Personally, that's how I would go at it. I recognize that Mike Lee doesn't like, Senator Lee is not a big fan of that 2001 use of force. So with him, they use this other justification of law enforcement protection.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of law enforcement, CNN is reporting that a team of FBI agents helped carry out this operation along with U.S. Special Forces. Does that make sense to you? Can you explain a little bit about what they might be doing in contingent with the U.S. military?
Yeah. So listen, the FBI and the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, have officials who are well trained not at the Delta Force level, but at a level where they can accompany units. I think it's unlikely that they would have played a significant kinetic role in this, but they could have been there for an immediate law enforcement imposition, at the point of, seizing President Maduro and his wife. So from my perspective, they could have been there. Personally, my experience with these operations is that they're on the back end of it to receive whatever personnel you've arrested. But it's not impossible. That's something the president can address in his talks, or it's something we never have to address. The tradecraft of our U.S. Special Forces is not something that we should really describe in great detail in public.
All right, retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. He is a former destroyer squadron commander and, of course, a senior fellow at the Foundation of Defense of Democracies. Sir, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time today.
We want to assemble our political panel as we wait to hear from President Trump. Bloomberg Politics contributor Jeannie Shanzano is back with us. Democracy